Dr. Saugata Bhaduri is among us, so without further ado, let me welcome him. He needs no introduction actually, but Professor Bhaduri is a distinguished academic and professor at the Center of English Studies, School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is an eminent scholar of literary and cultural studies. His areas of specialization include literary and cultural theory, translation and comparative literature, popular culture, colonial Bengal, Western philosophy, and classical Indian aesthetics. Dr. Bhaduri has served as visiting professor at several prestigious universities and institutions across Europe, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and has received numerous international research grants and academic recognitions. His scholarship is marked by interdisciplinary depth and global relevance. He has authored and edited several significant books and scholarly works. Among his notable publications are Polycoloniality, European Transactions with Bengal from the 13th to the 19th century, published by Bloomsbury, Negotiating Localization, Translating Power, and an introductory reader on literary theory. His work continues to make valuable contributions to contemporary debates in literary criticism, cultural history, and comparative studies. Professor Bhaduri is also widely respected as a mentor, speaker, and academic guide, whose insights inspire scholars and students. We are deeply honored to have him here with us today. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Saugata Bhaduri. Sir, over to you. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Right. Thank you so much for that that introduction. And I'm not too sure if I'd be able to live up to it. And I want to thank Anirban also for thinking of me and calling me to this conference and to share some thoughts with you on modernity. Indeed, it's the theme of the conference itself is very, very pertinent for our current times. Indeed, we need to think about the multiplicities, the pluralities of modernity, and whether modernity itself is even worth cherishing, or how we can work out perhaps the problems that one faces with modernity. So I'll share some thoughts with you. I'll try to be brief and probably wind up in maybe around 45 minutes or so, allowing maybe 10-15 minutes of discussion if possible, but I will have to leave it 12 in any case. So let me begin from the basics itself. First of all, the title that I have given, that I've provided for this particular address, itself directly refers to, and that would not be lost on anybody, any member of this very august audience. So it has a direct reference to Bruno Latour's now classic 1991 book. And well, it's dated because it's like 35 years old now, but nevertheless, so the whole idea that have we ever been modern, or rather, I mean, he doesn't put it in the interrogative, he rather puts it in the assertive mode. We have never been modern. So that is the categorical assertion that Bruno Latour's classic book makes. And I, of course, in my title have tried to modulate it in a more interrogative mood, because rather than dismissing modernity altogether, and rather than assertively stating that we have never been modern, and therefore there's no need even to think of us being modern, I have rather tried to question it, and I have asked the question, must we ever be modern? And wherein, as you would notice, so it's not even whether we can be modern. The emphasis in my title, or the subtitle of my talk, is on the mustness of it. So must we ever be modern? Also, as you would notice in this question, which could be treated as a rhetorical question perhaps, and maybe the answer will be, well, we must, or whatever, but we'll explore the vicissitudes of this question by the by. But as you would also notice is that there is probably a sense of futurity in this question, the way I've posed the question, because we may have never been modern, but maybe we can be modern, and must we be modern? So there is a futurity to it, and which would also be relevant to my talk. So let me begin by trying to think through the word modernity itself, and what does modernity entail, and how has modernity worked itself out, and therefore what are the emergent problems with modernity, and what can we do about it. So as you would realize, and again everyone would know it, the word modernity derives itself from this Latin adverb, mind you, not adjective, because the adjectival modernus will emerge later, but the adverb modo. And modo means right here, right now. The immediacy of it is precisely what the word modernity itself originally etymologically entails. So the here-ness of it. And this seems to be the first automatic problem that modernity therefore gets associated with, because it's invariably tied with metaphysics of presences, because the word modernity itself always ends up privileging the here and the now, the two senses of the word present, as you'd know, the nowness of it all. So the immediacy of it all, this particular moment, and the centrality of this particular moment, the here-ness, the nowness, that seems to be really the original building block of the concept of modernity. And that indeed is a big problem, because I need not go into a detailed critique of metaphysics of presences, because all of you would know that presentisms, or us being locked up in the present, us not being able to think about anything beyond this present, and us being captivated and tied with fetters, as it were, to the immediate present, is in itself a problem. Because how can we give in to the metaphysics of presences, or how can we escape this metaphysics of presences? Can we think of ways of somehow going beyond this absolute commitment to presentism that modernity as a concept originally etymologically entails? So that could be the entry point into my discussion. Now, as would be suggested, I'm sure that many would recall that maybe the possibility of the present not being a frozen block, but the present itself being variegated, is also very much included within definitions of modernity. So let's say one of the classic definitions of modernity by Baudelaire, none other than Baudelaire, in The Painter of Modern Life, 1863. He would have written it probably around 1859, 1860, but nevertheless, in 1863, it would have got published. And The Painter of Modern Life, this wonderful essay by Baudelaire, which most of you would have read, I'm sure, where he defines modernity as the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent. And in English translations, it could vary, because transitory and fugitive may have very different senses, perhaps. So the transient, the fleeting, the contingent, that is the usual English translation of the one phrase definition of modernity that Charles Baudelaire presents. So one could argue that, but is it not that while I would have begun by bringing this etymological root in mind, and modernity entails this frozen present, but is it not that Baudelaire already suggested that rather we have to inflect modernity, and that is his definition of modernity, towards the transient, towards the fleeting, towards the contingent? So are we not already within modernity? And this is precisely the debate that I would enter in greater detail later. So is it not that within modernity itself, rather than being necessarily fettered to this inviolable presentism of the modo, inviolable being tied up to this instant alone, is it not that Baudelaire had already inflected it and brought in the transitoriness of it, the fleetingness of it, the contingency of it? So is it not that within modernity itself, there are indeed conceptualizations that could allow us to escape from this being bound to the metaphysics of presences? Well, to a certain extent, yes. And indeed, I would build up on this possibility of going to come, perhaps, a to-come of modernity, rather than one that is caught within the absolute presentisms of modernity. But as far as Baudelaire is concerned, one can counter-argue, almost to argue against the argument that I myself presented, that Baudelaire probably was not really talking about high modernity. He was indeed almost a precursor of modernism, so to say. And modernism, as we do understand from the, again, classic definition by Jean-François Lyotard, modernism is actually a part of postmodernity rather than modernity itself. So as we do know, in the usual timeline of modernity, it is presumed that modernity would have lasted, through an early modern period, which is roughly from 1450. Well, one always ties things up to certain historical incidents rather than trying to necessarily conceptually talk about it, but these historical incidents might become good milestones. So 1453 to roughly 1790. So from the fall of Constantinople to the French Revolution. So that is roughly thought of as early modernity. The long 19th century, as it is often called, as Hobsbawm would have classically called it, the long 19th century, that is from 1790 to 1914, that is from the French Revolution to the First World War, is thought of as high modernity. And after 1914 would have become late modernity, or which has even in certain other definitions been qualified as post-modernity. One can even push, because I was just arguing that Baudelaire is postmodern and not really someone who belongs to high modernity. But my own timeline that I presented, if 1860s it follows the classic, let's say, the long 19th century paradigm, it would be very much within high modernity. But as one would understand that there are alternative timelines given to modernity, like by Toynbee, the Arnold Toynbee in his History of the World, would have suggested that from 1870s, post-modernity would have started. So Toynbee would have probably been the first person to historically assign a date to post-modernity, and which would be 1870s. It's from 1870s that post-modernity starts. And it is indeed in the 1870s that the word postmodern was first used by someone called John Watkins Chapman to qualify certain tendencies in post-impressionist art that emerged. But that is quite besides the point. The point that I was making was that though 1860s is when Baudelaire would have talked about the possible transitoriness, the possible transience, the possible fleetingness, the possible contingency within modernity, and therefore in a way displacing the initial concern that I had expressed, the first concern with modernity, that modernity is too caught up with the metaphysics of presences. So if Baudelaire in 1860 had already inflicted it and brought in the notion of fleetingness, then would it be right to really talk about modernity only in terms of this frozenness in the present? Well, my counter argument that I was presenting was that writing in the 1860s, and therefore it was the fag end of modernity, Baudelaire already almost preempted what would be modernism, and thereby one goes back to Lyotard's classic definition of modernism and postmodernism, both being parts of postmodernity, where already certain uncertainties would have come up, which would have destabilized the general notion of modernity that we would have grown up with. So in a way, Baudelaire's identification of transitoriness, Baudelaire's identification of fleetingness or fugitiveness, and Baudelaire's identification of contingency may not necessarily end up in inflecting modernity itself towards a modernity that is of the non-modo sort, a non-modo modernity, as it could be, but rather a modernist requalification of the same through a postmodern lens. And wherein one must understand, again, to go back to Lyotard's classic definition of modernism and postmodernism, as Lyotard famously argues in answering the question, what is postmodernism? That somehow, towards the fag end of the 19th century, there emerges this situation of uncertainty. Suddenly, modernity seems to be crumbling. The promises of modernity seem to suddenly not really hold and go. The center cannot, things fall apart. You know the situation. And wherein, as Lyotard says, two stances emerge to almost cope with this postmodern situation. So it's all postmodernity. But to cope with this postmodern situation, two stances emerge. One is modernism. So modernism is essentially a part of postmodernity, because modernism emerges as a particular aesthetic stance where, shocked with the sudden collapse of structures, shocked with the sudden fact of the center not being able to hold, you recognize the transitoriness of it all, but still you want to somehow cobble up some semblance of centrality, some semblance of sense of the moment. Whereas postmodernism, we are not discussing postmodernism today, so one can just keep it aside, but nevertheless, to just complete the circuit that I have already brought before you. So postmodernism, on the other hand, for Lyotard, is that particular stance within postmodernity, which does not try to nostalgically cobble up some sense of unity, in spite of having discovered transitoriness, and rather regales in this fragmentariness. But we are not going into postmodernism. Let me return to Baudelaire. So could it be that Baudelaire's identification of transitoriness, Baudelaire's identification of fugitiveness, Baudelaire's identification of contingency within modernity ultimately did not really lead to a non-modo modernity, but rather led to modernism, and which was somehow an attempt, even after recognizing the transitoriness, even after recognizing the non-moderness, to still try to cobble up some sense of the instant. So therefore, even Baudelaire and modernism would be caught up in this instant itself, the instant, which could be fleeting, which could be contingent, which could be transitory, but still it's the instant that one would still talk about. It's the urban life that Baudelaire would still talk about. So in short, the point that Baudelaire would have already added, the notion of transience and fugitiveness, whatever you want to call it, fleetingness and contingency, to the idea of modo, would not have necessarily redeemed the metaphysics of presences that modernity indeed is connected with, and which would lead me therefore to my corollary point, that therefore post-modernity itself, or at least the modernist branch of post-modernity, would not be able to redeem modernity of this utter fetteredness to metaphysics of presences. So maybe the two calmness, the non-modo modernity that my first problem would have been trying to look for, must be perhaps located elsewhere. So let me leave you with the first problem here. The second problem with modernity that emerges, and which we all know, is precisely that modernity somehow was imagined as fundamentally a European project, which thereafter, through colonial modernity, would have been modularly spread, and Benedict Anderson's work and so many other works would have precisely focused on this modular projection of a particular kind of modernity, and which thereafter had to be perhaps lapped up through colonial modernity by so many others all around the world. So modernity, as much as it may be appealing to us, because modernity is always thought of in terms of progress, always thought of in terms of democracy, always thought of in terms of breakdown of erstwhile feudal hierarchies and the setting up of a new world order where egalitarianism may rule, is, however, and we all know this, and therefore one need not dwell much upon this, the second problem with modernity is, however, inextricably connected to a certain European supremacy, a certain model of European supremacy, a certain modular circulation of that particular notion around the world, and of course colonialism, and therefore all the exploitations that come with it are necessarily connected to the project of modernity. And indeed, therefore, there have been so many critics of the particular kind of modernity that would have been circulated all over the world. And one would talk about, therefore, alternate modernities, one would talk about multiple modernities, one would straightaway critique the basic hierarchies that underlie modernity. Because whose modernity is it anyway? Could modernity really bring about what it apparently holds in its rather golden projection of itself? Because ultimately, is not modernity contingent upon exploitation? Is not modernity contingent upon global inequalities? And therefore, what we term as modern, what we probably cherish as modern, need not necessarily deliver the very goods of modernity, the very promises of modernity that apparently we also end up associating with it. So there has indeed been a lot of critique of these disparate sides of modernity. But I will pick up two aspects of this to build up, therefore, my second and third problem with modernity. And one is indeed a bit more obvious, which is the whole idea of industrialization, because modernity has been contingent upon the European modernity, the model of modernity, the modular modernity that thereafter had been spread all over the world through coloniality, has been contingent upon industrialization. And therefore, modernity, in spite of its myths of progress, have always been rooted in a certain exploitation of our natural resources, has always been driven towards, and that is precisely what has pushed us currently, is continuously pushing us towards this vortex of environmental crisis, of climate change, of the current ecological concerns all around us. These are direct byproducts of modernity. So this is a second point that we also must keep in mind, that is ultimately modernity as received, as modularly received, being contingent upon industrialization, is necessarily also contributive towards perhaps the gravest issues that face our world today, namely pollution, namely environmental climate change, environmental crisis, etc., etc. But the other thing that also modularly was circulated by modernity through its colonial modern channels is perhaps an equally grave problem, which is the notion of the nation. So nation, as we must understand, and nationalism that comes with it also emerge only, and again, Benedict Anderson would have very clearly, since I already referred to Benedict Anderson, one could pick up any other channel of trying to connect modernity or modular modernity as it was transferred through colonial modern channels all over the world, connecting it to the question of nationalism and the problems of the nation could be traced from many other thinkers too. One need not only invoke Benedict Anderson here, but nevertheless, one must understand that the notion of the nation emerges with modernity in Europe. Because before the coming of modernity, the idea of the nation, where necessarily one language, one religion must be associated with one particular governmental territory, and that itself, its governmentality, will necessarily have to therefore take the form of a certain vile xenophobia, a certain vile exclusion of the other, a certain non-welcoming of the other, a certain non-reaching out to the other. We all know the problems with the nation. So nationalism, as Rabindranath put it majorly, is probably the gravest problem that humanity has ever faced. And we in our own country, at the other end of modernity perhaps, and globally, all over the world, with the emergence of sectarianisms, fundamentalisms, where certain religions necessarily try to prove their supremacy over certain territories in the name of the nation, and this inextricable connection between certain religious modularities and certain national territories, that itself is a direct fallout of modernity. So just like environmental crisis is what I call the gravest problem that's facing us today, the global emergence, and we were having sort of a honeymoon period perhaps, and I'll just go into it in a minute. Ever since we thought, and I'll just come to it in a minute because I would talk about globalization in a minute, we thought, but let me just preempt it nevertheless. So we thought that somehow from the late 80s onwards, with perhaps the fall of the bipolar world, which was always caught up in this chain of Cold War, maybe we would have entered a phase and which corresponds to globalization. I'll just come to globalization in a minute. We've come to a phase where once again, transnationally, so I'm deliberately invoking the word transnational because that's a word that has been used in the title of this conference itself. So we thought for a minute that maybe national bindings that modernity kind of drove us into have become a thing of the past, and we can indeed transnationally now cooperate through altogether late modern and otherwise than modern, late capitalist or otherwise than capitalist modes of circulation, modes of production, modes of consumption, and the world could be a happy family once again. But evidently that honeymoon period, as I called it, did not last very long, maybe just for about 25 years or so, and now we are back to probably fundamentalisms of an even vile sort. And globally, we have these competitive fundamentalisms, sectarianisms, communalisms, and fascisms really raising their head. And that leads me to, within the same point, the idea of fascism itself, because fascism is ultimately probably the culmination of modernity, the automatic fallout of nationalism, the automatic fallout of this real problem that modernity automatically came up with, which is the notion of the nation, had to probably culminate in something like fascism. And incidentally, and this I'm again preempting something that I'll say later, because in the last couple of minutes of Anirban's introductory talk, I did hear Habermas being talked about. So in a way, this bringing together, which I'll come to in a minute, but let me just get back to what I was talking about. The fascism, the word fascism, etymologically, once again, and etymology is always very important. And it is connected cognately even to English words like fasten, to bring together. So the word fascism literally means to binding together. Actually, in Italian, binding together of sticks. So taking sticks and binding them together. So the I deliberately kind of preempted the binding together metaphor, because when I would talk about Habermas's idea of suturing together certain disparate strands, one should always be wary of maybe binding as a metaphor in itself, or binding as a mode in itself. But to get back to what I was talking about, so fascism might well be the culmination of modernity. Well, one could say that historically fascism would have taken birth only at the other end of modernity, that is after the First World War, where classically, following all timelines, modernity would have been thought to have ended. But nevertheless, the seeds of nationalism and the seeds of identifying one language, one religion with one geographical territory to be pursued by one governmentality, that had its logical fallout in fascism. So which automatically entails, therefore, the very crystallization of the kind of xenophobias, the kind of jingoisms, the kind of otherization and hatred towards the other that fascism becomes the real pinnacle of. And to get back to what I was talking about, it seemed that perhaps to a long modernity, perhaps, that is till the end of the Second World War rather than the end of the First World War, we would have got rid of this real bane of modernity once and for all. Maybe fascism is over once and for all, and we'd have learned from our mistakes. But clearly, now we are in the vortex of real fascism, and the lingering on of modernity, therefore, and the lingering on of this notion of the nation and nationalism and communalism and sectarianisms really is puzzling, but nevertheless something that we have to continuously contend with. So in short, the third problem that I can come up vis-a-vis modernity is precisely this focus in modernity on nationalism, culminating in fascism, and the fact that we have to perhaps find some way out from that. Just like for the first problem, that is the being bound to metaphysics of presences, probably one has to find some way out in the to come. Just like for the second problem that I raised vis-a-vis modernity, that is its necessary connection to industrialization and therefore its contribution to environmental crisis, it goes without saying that probably therefore we have to look for a mode to handle the environmental crisis that stares in our face. Similarly, as far as the third problem is concerned, so we have to perhaps look for ways out of modernity, which necessarily is bound to nationalism and by extension, therefore, to fascism, especially in our current times. We have to find a way out. Now, what is the way out? So herein, I would just go back to what I did mention a little while back. So could transnationalism be a good enough template to work with? That is, well, if nation state is the problem, a problem that we have inherited from modernity, and all the sectarianisms, communalisms, otherizations, xenophobias that come with it are really the problem, then could we think about a cooperative model amongst nations, a transnational modernity, as it were, as this conference also talks about, where therefore we probably somehow find our way out of this being fettered by nationalism that modernity entails? Well, it could have probably been, and had it worked out that way, it would have been wonderful. But as I said, our experiences with globalization, and a lot of us were globalization enthusiasts, perhaps, and indeed, the fact that suddenly capital itself is not nationally controlled anymore, and therefore we moved on to late capital, where through this virtualization and the emergence of information technology, the world suddenly shrinking beyond its sectarianisms unto this global village, where through transnational cooperation, it suddenly seemed that we have woken up to this wonderful idea of the globe as a family. But it did not really work out that well, as I said. So within a couple of decades, the original promises of transnational, only transnational, that is modernities, in the form of globalization, did not really deliver the goods, because ultimately, even in this transnational version, modernity was inextricably connected, as it appears, to certain elements of that erstwhile modernity. Just like, as I argued, even the fleeting modernity of Baudelaire could not really get rid of the modo-ness. It seems that even this transnational possibility of globalization making a new kind of modernity emerge, a transnational modernity perhaps, alternative modernities, elsewhere, multiple modernities. Well, there are so many books that have been written on the possibilities of modernities, including, let's say, I myself in my polycoloniality would have talked about polycolonial modernity. So rather than one colonial modernity, there have been multiple modernities. There have been multiple modernities which, however, probably get percolated down colonial lines, and which, however, do not necessarily rid themselves of the fundamental connection to capital, which in itself, having got decentered, still is capital at the end of the day. And it so appears that transnational modernities, multiple modernities, polycolonial modernities, plural modernities, transnational, I've already said, globalization would not necessarily have solved the problem. And as is clear, that we are back perhaps to the very vortex of modernity, the very modernity that we thought was problematic, or that problematic aspect of modernity, which is based on exploitation, which is based on otherization, which is based on xenophobia, which is based on precisely thinking of the other as someone who we must rail against, is not something that we've been able to get rid of. So do we have to further expand the scope of transnational modernity and global modernity to some other model perhaps, and wherein I'm already preempting the other part of the title of this conference, which is planetarity. So which is, the planet is different from the globe. The planet and planetarity itself entails something far more encompassive than transnational modernities. But let me just hold on to that thought there, because I would indeed tie all this up. Let us move to a fourth problem of modernity. The fourth problem of modernity is its absolute insistence on the human subject. Needless to say, early modernity in Europe began with self-fashioning, with the idea of humanism, with the idea of the subject itself, the subject who would be invested with all agency. And needless to say, therefore, early modernity developed around and developed into the whole idea of the liberal ideology of laissez-faire, the liberal ideology of the human subject, if one has it in one. You all know the idea of self-fashioning. So the whole idea of the human self, a certain anthropocentrism, lies at the very basis of modernity. Modernity essentially is an anthropocentric project. It's a humanistic project. And once again, since I will tie all this up towards the end, and I'm also keeping an eye on the watch, this being a familiar territory for all of you. So not only has the whole generation of a certain anthropocentric worldview, but even the geological changes that the Earth, and since I already invoked the planet in my previous point, the Earth has undergone, and which have been theorized as the Anthropocene. You all know the Anthropocene, the apparent geological age that our planet has been thrust into because of the centrality of the anthropos. How the human beings would have somehow caused certain damages to the Earth. Damage is a strong word, certain changes to the Earth, where we have probably entered into a whole new geological era, that of the Anthropocene. But anyway, so the fourth problem of modernity, and I'm just breezing through it a bit because, again, as I said, this is familiar territory for all of you, is its reliance on anthropocentrism, resulting in perhaps, and since I've already invoked the planet, resulting in perhaps a certain anthropocenic build-up of this particular Earth, or pushing the planet towards a geological era that would be only Anthropocenic in nature. And needless to say, I mean, that in itself is problematic. Not only the human, sometimes we know all the problems with humanism itself, liberal humanism itself, as to what the definition of that human being is. Does that human even include anyone other than the white, straight, affluent male? Does it really include even other human beings? Forget non-human beings. And does it even include, and obviously it doesn't include, the non-human others with whom we share this planet, with whom we have to have bonds perhaps, with whom we do have bonds perhaps. So a fourth problem of modernity is this anthropocentrism, is this latent humanistic anthropocentrism, and which indeed we have to contend with even more and more. A fifth problem, and with which I'm slowly moving towards my end game, that modernity also poses, is the splintering of rationality. And this is something that would bring us, well, not directly to Habermas, because Habermas would have probably theorized it far more systematically, but Max Weber already thought about it, that with the coming of modern, and this is what will make me lead into Bruno Latour, because this also becomes the entry point into Latour. So as Max Weber originally theorized, that with the coming of modernity, rationality itself splintered into three non-intersecting disciplinary clusters, or three non-intersecting modes of thought. One which concerned the natural world, and which therefore crystallized into natural sciences. One which concerned the social world, and which therefore crystallized into the social sciences. And the other which concerned the human world, and which therefore, the human world as in the world of culture, the world of language, the world of imaginative expression, and which therefore crystallized into the humanities. So the disciplinary splintering of natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities is a direct fallout of modernity. And these three distinct parts of natural sciences is indeed what Habermas also concerns himself with. So for Habermas, as we do know, all that I have said notwithstanding, so indeed modernity has had these problems. Modernity is bound to the metaphysics of presences. Modernity is necessarily tied up to the colonial project of exploitation. Modernity is indeed tied up to the question of nationalism. Modernity has all these problems, there is no doubt about that. But nevertheless, as Habermas strongly argues, maybe modernity still has promises. Modernity still has things to offer. Only modernity has been an unfinished project. And that is Habermas's classic assertion. And there is a need for us to almost make modernity work again. And why is modernity an unfinished project? Modernity is an unfinished project because modernity, unfortunately, got splintered. So on the one hand, cultural modernity itself got separated. And then within that, the splintering into these three branches, three different modes, and the three would never meet anymore. So the emergence of specialization, which even Foucault has talked about so much. So within modernity, you can either be a natural scientist or a social scientist or a humanist. The colleges, the curricular structure itself entails that you must already commit yourself to some discipline and become a specialist in that alone. And knowledge structures therefore would also necessarily follow any one of these three trajectories, either natural sciences or social sciences or human sciences, if we call it human sciences, that is. And it is precisely the splintering that doesn't allow the actual promises of modernity, which could still be democratic, which could still be secular, which could still be egalitarian, to be really delivered. That is Habermas's strong point. And somehow through communicative action, if we can bring these three together again, if once again we can rend through these rifts in specialized, rifts caused by modern specialization, and once again if we could bring it all together, tie it all together, suture is the metaphor. And earlier in a slight digression, I have talked about how tying together itself may always often be problematic too, because tying together has within it that fascistic possibility of really, I mean, etymologically and otherwise, of bringing things together. But Habermas' strong point, as we know, is precisely this, that somehow the splintering of rationality into these three clusters, that is the root problem. if somehow we can bring this all together, if somehow we can bring up a new mode of communicative action where sciences, social sciences, and humanities can work together, I'm simplifying to the extreme, then perhaps those unkept promises of modernity, those unfulfilled promises of modernity could be delivered. Well, perhaps, but I'll just come to it in a minute when I sum things up. But this exactly is the issue that Bruno Latour takes up in We Have Never Been Modern, and wherein he precisely says this, that somehow, and he simplifies, he deals with the triad, because indeed he talks about sciences, the social formations and language, the triad, the very triad that we have talked about, but he simplifies it further into a dyad. And that is very, very important. The dyad is nature culture, the nature culture divide, so to say. Because ultimately, as Bruno Latour argues, that modernity tried to drive in this wedge between our dealings with nature and our dealings with culture, making us presume that somehow natural history and human history, natural history and social history, human history, I'm deliberately using social history and human history to still refer to the triad, the original Weberian triad, though in Bruno Latour, the triad having been written will somehow be also collapsed into a dyad, and this dyad is also important. So somehow, as Bruno Latour argues, that modernity tries to drive in this wedge, tries to bring in this difference between nature and culture, between natural history and human history, natural history and social history. However, it is not workable, and never has such a wedge really worked out. And Bruno Latour argues, those who have not read We Have Never Been Modern can just read it up, and a very influential book. He argues that look at all examples around you. It is not possible to clinically distinguish between what is natural and what is cultural. And that is where modernity has not only failed, but probably modernity never even began, because modernity's presumption is the splintering. The fifth problem of modernity that I picked up, the splintering being the primary agenda of modernity, the fact that we never, however, really got splintered. And somehow, be it in pre-modern ways or be it in modern ways, the persistence of the non-splintered is precisely what makes modernity in itself a project that was a non-starter. And we've probably never been modern. Now, whether Bruno Latour can be therefore called as someone who takes us out of modernity unto post-modernity is debatable, but Bruno Latour himself would strongly disagree with the term postmodern, or he being qualified as postmodern, or even pre-modern for that matter, because the idea is not to junk modernity and move back perhaps obscurantistically to some primeval past, or to even regale. And because as I argued, postmodernism is ultimately also a part of modernity, an extension of modernity, so to say. So Bruno Latour would rather use the word a-modern or non-modern rather than postmodern or pre-modern, rather than chronologically inflicting his disagreements with modernity. That we have never been modern, according to Bruno Latour, makes us perhaps a-modern and non-modern. Now, interestingly, this distinction between natural history and human history, or the distinction between these two things, which have been thought separately, modernity began as a project of thinking natural history and human history separately. The bringing together of these two is precisely also done by Dipesh Chakraborty and others. So as you do, I'm sure all of you are aware of Dipesh Chakraborty's works vis-a-vis the climate of history, etc., where precisely he makes this argument, the same Latourian argument, extended further, and therefore correcting us back to the question of Anthropocene that I brought up, because Dipesh Chakraborty's entire take on how to modulate the Anthropocene is dependent precisely on this, that somehow through modernity, we have always taken natural history and human history as two separate disciplines, as if the history of capital has to be studied otherwise than the history of natural resources and the history of geological depletion. But on the contrary, these two are connected. So what I'm talking about through, I've invoked three people out here simultaneously, Habermas, and one of them probably directly talks about modernity being a project worth living through. And the two others are probably a little critical of the same, but nevertheless, so the three people that I just mentioned, Habermas, Bruno Latour, and Dipesh Chakraborty, all seem to suggest, and this is the next problem of modernity, the final problem of modernity, after which I'll just tie it all up. So the final problem of modernity that I have raised, which is somehow modernity also led to a splintering of rationality, a split being wedged between three disciplinary clusters, or it could be two, it doesn't really matter, where, however, the natural, whatever invokes, whatever concerns nature, has somehow been seen as separate from whatever concerns the human beings. And that itself is a root cause of much of our lack of environmental concerns today, much of the root cause of much of what the Anthropocene has brought about, etc., etc. And all three seem to suggest a bringing together of these. So though Bruno Latour would have probably thought of it slightly differently, and that would be the last point that I make in this regard, which is actor networks. So which would directly connect to the question of planetarity, which I have left hanging for a moment. But all three seem to suggest that the splintering, the problem of modernity lies in the splintering of rationality, and the solution lies in perhaps bringing these splinters together again, tying them up together again, thinking of them simultaneously again. Though in Bruno Latour's case, the togetherness is being brought about through a network of, so the idea is that human history cannot be thought of as different from natural history, because ultimately the non-human actors and the human actors are inextricably bound in networks in which all of them are but actors, and which together would have worked towards bringing in the world as it is. So the moment we deflect our understanding of a splintered notion of rationality and bring together this idea of bringing things together, perhaps through actor network modes, and which may be more helpful here rather than the more notional binding through communicative action that Habermas talks about, or the thinking through this distinction between natural history and human history that Dipesh Chakraborty talks about. So whatever. So actor networks is a very important point, and which brings us back to a loose end that I have left out, and which is exactly this notion of the planet. So at one point, as you would notice, I had moved from globe, whether globality can be a way, or transnational modernity can be a way out of the modular modernity that we've been handed down, and one kind of almost got led to the idea of planetarity. Now, we do know planetarity, and again, I would not waste time because I can see that I should probably bring things to a close. So planetarity is again something that all of you are familiar with, and though Spivak would have originally used the word slightly differently in her 2003 book, but nevertheless that became the source of this notion of planetarity, her book, Death of a Discipline, that is, and wherein the strong difference made between globe as an inert thing and planet as a lived thing. And planet is a lived thing because not only, and herein one would stretch planetarity a bit more than what Spivak 23 years back would have originally thought. So stretching planetarity to, and so let's say why talk about the planet? Why not Earth itself? If globe is a problematic word, and yet we need to deflect or inflect modernity outside of the scope of nationality, why not talk of it as Earth? Because Earth, as you must understand, it does entail the actor networks between human and non-human beings, and it does conceive of this Earth in itself with all its geological and all its biological resources as being fundamentally caught up in some network. There is no doubt about that. But the Earth, at the end of the day, is still only one planet. Whereas planetarity, the notion of planetarity, entails a further extension of the network. Because the moment you do not think of the exceptionalism of the Earth, and therefore Earth being your point of departure, which would in a way become geocentric once again, almost pre-modern therefore, but rather the moment you think of Earth as just another planet, it is but another speck in this whole network of other planets, the solar system itself. It's but another planet. There are so many other planets, and the solar system itself is also part of a broader network. So planetarity actually also brings in a further scope of completely decentering or very exceptional presumptions that in a way would have even smacked of modernity, in spite of us having displaced it through actor networks unto probably taking the whole planet into consideration. So finally, therefore, in the final analysis, is modernity, so modernity has its problems. Modernity has its store of problems. I've already listed before you some 5-6 problems, one after the other, and each probably graver than the other. But can there be some kind of a modernity or modernities that we can still perhaps cherish, not as a given thing, not something that can be exhausted in the present, because that is the fundamental problem that I began with, but probably some kind of a future anterior modernity, some kind of a modernity to come, some kind of a modernity that is planetary in nature, and some kind of a modernity that indeed therefore can make us hold on to the whole dreams of some kind of an egalitarianism without, almost a messianicity without messianism kind of a thing. So some kind of an egalitarianism without there being some kind of a delivered egalitarianism. And wherein, and this is the last thing that I would invoke, since one has already mentioned Anthropocene, and one has already therefore to sum up the things together, and therefore to zero down and end my talk with what I have in mind. So as I mentioned, the problems with modernity are the following: that it is too caught up in the metaphysics of presence, and therefore probably one has to think of a to come, a speculative to come, a never enshrined, a never exhausted to come. So can we think of a modernity that will never be delivered to us and will forever be of the order of the to come, forever speculative? Point number one. Point number two, I talked about industrialization and degradation of the earth's resources. So can we tie that to come modernity to a possibility of us somehow being able to, and not eco-critically perhaps, because that would be almost aimed towards a persistence of modernity, but rather can we think of a more sustainable mode of modernity that tries to deal with the environmental concerns that we have? Can we further, at a third level, think of a modernity to come that is somehow environmentally aware, and it somehow locates itself not in the nation state and not within nationalisms, fascisms, communalisms, sectarianisms, but rather thinks of beyond these categories unto what would be transnational perhaps? And why stop at transnationality? Can we think of a to come environmentally aware transnational modernity that is indeed planetary enough to take into its scope not just human actors, but also non-human actors, geological, biological, otherwise than human, mechanical? Could we think of a modernity that could be all-encompassing? Could we think of a modernity that therefore, instead of rending through rationality and leading to these specializations of disciplines wherein human history and natural history will forever be separated, can we think of a to come modernity that's somehow being tentacularly connected and not fascistically? Mind you, the binding, the rectilinear binding that the metaphor of fascism allows, as opposed to the tentacular connections, the rhizomatic connections, the slippery, tenuous connections that do not bind but connect. Could we think of a modernity like that? And wherein I would leave you with this one counter-anthropocenic, or rather not counter-anthropocenic necessarily, but let's say a reparative rather than a merely paranoid, critical, eco-critical approach to the Anthropocene model that, and already I having talked about tentacles, you would already have got Donna Haraway recollected in your minds. So the whole idea of Thulucene, the whole idea of this speculative future never to come perhaps, but something that we could work towards, where the earth is indeed at the center, that's why it's Thulucene, but where in the speculative future to come, we, not necessarily as human beings who would forever rule the world in the name of modernity, but we perhaps as composed, we perhaps as dead beings in the future, having rendered ourselves unto the earth through our own tentacular speculative connections with otherwise than humans, can we perhaps, almost in a reframing of the Bruno Latourian problem, can we perhaps rethink this speculative to-comeness of a modernity where the actors can indeed connect, albeit tenuously, ushering in, therefore, a connective modernity that may hold for us those very promises that an industrially devastating nationalism and fascism-driven modernity could not deliver us. So must we ever be modern? Well, perhaps we must be modern, but only insofar as that can only be a non-realized becoming of modern, forever in the gerundive sense, the present continuous sense of the to come. So thank you very much for being such a patient audience, and I'd be very glad to answer very briefly, perhaps, to any queries that you may have. And I congratulate Anirban and the others to think of this very relevant topic, and I wish the conference all the very best.
Thank you, sir. We'll just take questions. We have 5 minutes, and then we can, because Dr. Bhaduri needs to go at 12. So do we have questions?
Yes, can I just ask one? My name is Dhritiman, and Saugata, I'm again mesmerized. I mean, nothing has really much changed. I mean, I heard you 20 years back in IIT Kharagpur, and again, hearing you once again. So it was really very interesting. Just very quickly, while you are not playing down with the word modernity, you want to retain that word, and it's very visible why you are doing this. But at the same time, I think this question can also be asked that people who are not, have arrived into the modernity in the sense that Partha Chattopadhyay and many others have theorized, are the biggest takers of it, right now. They are the biggest constituency of this, the fascist-oriented nationalistic modernity that you are talking about. So, how to sort of understand this contradiction? I mean, could you just briefly dwell on that?
Yeah, this contradiction emerges from two things. First of all, the dehumanization or the non-humanization of the not being treated as human and therefore being extended unto being at the receiving end of precisely those sectarian ideologies that modernity itself built on. So that has precisely led to this deprivation. So if there is a mode of thinking of the promises of modernity, but that would not necessarily be rooted in humanism or the build-up of that subject of humanity, then perhaps these others who have been excluded precisely out of the project of humanism may stand included in a speculative modernity to come. And that leads to the second point, which is that it is precisely, let's say, precisely so that these others do finally somehow also be included, and included only tentacularly, only tentatively perhaps, within some kind of a rhetoric that is not driven through development, driven to the ideology of development, but driven to the ideology of inclusion, a planetary inclusion, that a to-comeness. So the fact that, let's say, certain sections of the population have not been touched by modernity, all the more entails that we must work towards a modernity to come. So that is precisely the point. So modernity has its problems, but if we can conceive of a modernity, a non-modo modernity, as I called it, a modernity to come, which is not necessarily based on humanism and its allied problems, then perhaps we can indeed think of an inclusive future anterior to come modernity, which I also went on to further qualify as perhaps a Thulucenic modernity.
I don't think so. Do we have time for one more question? Or
yes, one
yes.
more.
So just one more. So Shostik Kormakar has his hand raised up. Shostik, please put it very briefly.
I just want to relate the one concept that Bauman has already taken, that it is liquid modernity. And could you explain this concept in very brief with your arguments?
Yeah, Bauman actually talks about modernity and ambivalence. Berman talks about liquid modernity. So he would go on to talk about so basically he's talking about post-modernity for all practical purposes. So the image of liquidity, or how the solidity of modernity, in fact, Marx also has this very interesting definition of modernity. All that is solid melts into air. This is a one-line definition of modernity by Marx, as you'd know. Now, a solid melting into air, perhaps, I'm just digressing a little metaphorically. Solid melting into air is the model of sublimation. So like camphor, where solid becomes directly air. without passing to the liquid phase. So the sublimatory model in the Marxian metaphor of modernity, where all that is solid melts into air, has been provided for a conduit, a liquid conduit, a liquidity, where indeed before the solid can melt into air, it must pass to that molten stage of the liquid, perhaps. Now, liquid modernity in Berman's terms is almost akin to what we generally understand as postmodernity. And Berman himself is also not particularly, let's say, unambiguous about that. The point that I was mentioning was that maybe solidity being rendered liquid and rendered fluid may not be good enough, because as you must have gathered from the tenor of my talk, maybe in a somewhat Habermasian way, perhaps, it's not transcendence, that's a bad word used here. The passing on of solid modernity with all its problems unto a liquid modernity of the postmodern sort may not really solve the problems, because the flow of the liquid may still not necessarily reach those non-modo nooks and corners that somehow lie even outside the scope of the flow of the liquid. So therefore, I am not too convinced by just a liquefaction of modernity and it's solving all our problems. So I think liquid modernity can at best be an intermediate stage, and maybe it is the more aerial modernity that Marx had talked about, and us being able to talk about it in perhaps means that are otherwise than merely liquefying, which do follow all the laws of motion of the solid, albeit in a different state, would be something that we should better be on the lookout for. So while I appreciate the argument of liquid modernity, I don't think that a liquefaction of modernity would really solve our problems.
Thank you. I think we can engage with this for another hour. So you give us an enthralling talk, which much to think about. And thank you so much for taking out a generous chunk of your time to spend with us here today. It has been our privilege to host you, sir. Thank you so much for being here. And we will let you go. It's 12, so we will stick to your time and our time. Thank you so much once again for being here. Really, it was fantastic. I mean, we were enthralled. Sir, I had 2 or 3 questions, but we'll do that some other time. So you've been fantastic.
Thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you. Fantastic lecture. I was actually reminded of Derrida's introduction to Catherine Malabou's The Future of Hegel. The key point was the crux word was perhaps.
Right.
Dangerous perhaps. So we actually are ending the lecture.
Right.
This perhaps the future and theory.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, and I'll take your leave. Bye bye.
Yes, sir.